Redditors who work at remote places like forest officers, oil rig workers, etc. What creepy things have you noticed while at work? 1. I work on North Sea oil rigs, on an ad hoc basis, primarily off the coast of Scotland. I wouldn't describe anything I've seen as particularly creepy, but it can definitely be a strange and unsettling place at times. For example, fog can roll in unexpectedly, completely transforming the atmosphere. One moment, you can clearly see other rigs in the distance, and the next moment, they vanish as if they were never there. Sometimes, you can barely see the walkways just a few feet in front of you. Or, if you're walking on grating, the sea 60 meters below your feet becomes invisible, even though you can still hear the muffled roar of the waves. It's eerie how quickly the fog can blanket everything, turning a perfectly clear day into an impenetrable wall of mist within minutes. Another unsettling experience is feeling the rig sway under the pressure of high winds and rough seas. Even though it's a fixed-leg platform, there's something unnerving about your workplace gently swaying, especially when you know it's not supposed to move. On my last trip, I worked my first ever night shift, which I found particularly eerie. With the background hum of the plant in the distance, I walked around the rig, but didn't encounter a single other person the entire shift. Normally, there are around 130 people on board, though smaller rigs might have fewer. Yet that night, it felt like I was completely alone. There's always a moment during a trip where the realization hits you that you are truly isolated. Most rigs I work on are about an hour's helicopter ride from land, so if anything were to go wrong, the situation could escalate quickly. It's an unnerving thought, too. I worked at a public forest, and one day someone reported a dead animal off the side of one of our trails. A few of us from the front desk hiked out to check it out. What we found was strange. It looked like a large chunk of liver, or maybe some other kind of organ. It was just a pile of smooth, red meat, but there wasn't any blood around it. The organ was wrapped in a t-shirt, with a few coins scattered around. We called our rangers to investigate, and one of them thought it might be a placenta. The strange part is that everyone entering the forest has to check in at the front desk. So someone either smuggled in a placenta or liver. Or more disturbingly, someone gave birth or removed an organ right there on the trails. We never figured out what it was, how it got there, or why it was wrapped up with coins. 3. During college, which was located far from any major city, I spent a lot of time in the woods surrounding the campus. There was a highly rated trail called the Loyalsac Trail, about an hour's drive from the university. I invited a friend to join me on a 50-mile backpacking trip along the trail over a long weekend. I'm an Eagle Scout, with extensive experience in the outdoors, having spent countless hours backpacking and camping. In the wilderness, you grow accustomed to minor spooky things. Coyote howls, rustling leaves, or the occasional unidentifiable noise in the night. But nothing is more unsettling than encountering people deep in the woods, especially under strange circumstances. We were about 20 miles into the trail when my friend and I set up camp. We chose a remote spot well off the trail, hidden by dense underbrush. It was a beautiful location on a peninsula where a creek met a river, leaving only one way in and out. We built a fire, cooked, and had a few drinks, but not enough to impair us. Around midnight, we extinguished the fire and headed into our tents for the night. At around 3 a.m., I awoke to the sound of voices, which seemed far too close for comfort. I peeked out of my tent and saw my friend doing the same. He quickly signaled me to stay quiet and pointed toward the trail. 4 adults, 3 men and 1 woman, were walking silently toward our camp. They had no lights, and only one of them carried a backpack, which seemed strange, given the distance they must have traveled. Gripping my survival knife, I prepared for the worst as they approached our extinguished fire pit and sat down. My friend asked them what they were doing in our camp. Instead of answering, they asked if we had any food. I tossed them a spare meal packet and asked why they were hiking without lights and so late at night. they replied in a monotone. "We don't use lights. We know where the trail is. It's better to hike late at night." Uneasy, my friend asked them to leave. They stood up and walked away without another word. We barely slept for the rest of the night, keeping watch to make sure they didn't return. In the morning, it all felt surreal, like a strange dream, except for the fuzzy cap they left behind, which I still have. For I was working alone one evening, fueling up the side boom on a job site in northern Canada. It was February, so it was pitch black, and I kept hearing strange noises over the loud hum of the pump. After looking around a few times and seeing nothing, I hopped in the truck and started driving. As I passed the side boom, I spotted a cougar sitting on top of a dirt pile, about 15 feet away. It had probably been watching me the entire time, and the sheer size and power of the animal were overwhelming. The cougar leaped off the 6-foot pile, effortlessly covering about 15 or 20 feet in a single bound. It was terrifying to think how close it had been, and how easily it could have taken me by surprise. 5. I worked as the county historic preservationist in southern Appalachia, focusing on maintaining the county-owned buildings and properties. One of the benefits of my job was living on site at one of the historic properties. This particular historic house was an imposing brick mansion built in the 1810s, while I resided in a small caretaker's house located about 20 feet away. Since this was in the backwoods, to deter trespassing and vandalism, the county had constructed an 8-foot-tall fence around the entire 5-acre property, topped with barbed wire. I mention this to emphasize that it was virtually impossible for anyone, or anything, to climb or jump over the fencing and enter the property. One night, after a late workday at another property, I drove up to my entrance gate, let myself in, and locked it securely behind me, before making the 100-yard drive down the gravel road to my house. There were no lights on the property, so I could only see what my headlights illuminated. As I turned my car around one of the outbuildings and parked it, my lights landed on a creature that I still struggle to describe accurately. It was about the size of a deer, with long, spindly legs and shaggy hair. It resembled a much taller version of a maned wolf, if you've ever seen one of those. That alone was disturbing, since there was no way a creature of that size should have been able to breach the fencing. What happened next is absolutely true. I got out of my car to get a better look, and as soon as I opened the door, the thing bolted away, not on 4 legs, but on 2. I watched in disbelief as it stood upright on its hind legs and sprinted away. At that point, I was utterly freaked out. I grabbed my mag light and shotgun from inside the house and tried to track it down, but there was no sign of it. No footprints, no tracks, nothing. I have no idea how it entered or exited my property. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on my couch with my shotgun in hand, watching the front door, hoping that whatever I had seen wouldn't come back. To this day, I can't explain what I witnessed, but it still sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. 6. I work for a power company, and my job involves restoring power after storms. One day, while working on a downed line, a woman approached, complaining that her power had gone out. We explained that we were working on it, and that her power should be back soon. She then said, "Oh good, because my son went down into the basement, and now I can't find him." Concerned, I grabbed a flashlight and followed her down the road to a dilapidated house that was partially collapsed. She went inside, and I followed. But as soon as I stepped through the door, she vanished from sight. I called out for her several times, but no one answered. Panicked, I ran back to our truck to call for help. As I was heading back, a man from the neighborhood approached and asked me what was wrong. I told him the situation, and he gave me a cold, hard stare before saying, "A mother and her son died in that house 4 years ago." To this day, I am still shaken by that experience. 7. One summer, I spent several weeks working on a conservation project in the remote wilderness of Wyoming. I was part of a crew tasked with camping out in the middle of nowhere for 2-week stretches to do. manual labor in areas that were too inaccessible for machines. During one particular stint, we were working on building, hiking and biking trails in a high-altitude desert wilderness area. The nearest townhome to just 41 people was a 2-hour car ride away. The sandy soil preserved tracks for long periods, making it an ideal location for trail work. One night, around 11:30 p.m., everyone else had gone to bed, but I stayed up a little later to read. The sky was pitch black, with clouds covering the stars, so the only light for miles was the beam from my headlamp. Suddenly, I heard footsteps walking around our camp, heading in the direction of the tents. My adrenaline spiked instantly, and I felt the hair on my arms rise. Two things immediately struck me as wrong. The person wasn't using a light to see, and the footsteps weren't coming from the tents, but going towards them instead. Within seconds, I dropped my book, stood up, and turned the corner of the tent to shine my light on the sleeping area. The sound had stopped, but I saw tracks in the dirt. The prints seemed to originate from one end of the camp, pass by my tent, move through the sleeping area, and then continue out of camp. By now, the rest of my crew had woken up and asked what was happening. I explained what I had heard and seen, and we all got up to inspect the boot prints. They were nearly identical to my own boots, except for one crucial detail. I had a rock stuck in my tread that created an odd, asymmetrical pattern. I wore a common style of work boot, but I also happened to wear size 15 double-wide boots, which made it highly unlikely that anyone else had been responsible for the prints. No one in the crew could have matched the size or tread of those boots. None of us slept well that night. Although we never heard or saw anything else after that, the incident left us all unnerved. A light rain a few days later washed away the tracks, but I distinctly remember how none of us wanted to step directly on the prints and deliberately avoided them, as if they were cracks in the sidewalk.